reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. Pull up a chair. I don't know why I say pull up a chair every time, as if you'd be standing waiting to sit down while listening to this podcast. Hey, you stand, you do what you need, do the washing up. I think that's where, doing the washing up or driving somewhere or just rolling around in my wheelchair. Those are all my favorite pastimes to do while listening to a podcast. Hey, you do what you do best. And while listening to your podcast, you enjoy whatever it is that you enjoy. It is wonderful to see you. And this week, much like we do every week, we come together, we take a look at a very confident declaration made by a politician or a public figure, in this case, a politician, and we take it for the question that we know on the inside, deep in our hearts, it was intended to be. Nobody intends to make confident declarations about a marginalized community without being well informed, right? So they must be questions. And so we take it for the question that we believe it was intended to be. And we try to look to the literature to see if we can't find a scientific consensus around an answer. And this week, oh my goodness, this week, just a couple of weeks ago, it was the Tory party conference. And for those plugged in to gender diverse communities and news from those communities, we were watching with bated breath as Tory politicians stood up and started speaking. Now, the cynic in me thinks that, this is a Tory party of, extremely low popularity right now. And they're a party looking for potentially a scapegoat, maybe trying to find a wedge issue that might be able to kind of provoke people to their side to vote for them in the next oncoming general election. And for one reason or another, the trans community has become that wedge issue. People call it the culture wars. That's no bad moniker in my view. And indeed, it is frightening. So we are watching with bated breath to see what the Tory politicians were going to, what our Conservative politicians, what the Prime Minister was going to say. And we weren't disappointed. They said some stuff. You guys. They just said some stuff. They said some stuff that kind of blew my mind, honestly. But we'll take it for the question. We know it was intended to be. We'll see if we can't find an answer. So here, there are two people I want to talk about. The first, we're going to hear from the Home Secretary, and then we're going to hear from the Prime Minister. So first up, an old favourite of the podcast, Suella Braverman, Home Secretary.
Trans women have no place in women's wards or indeed any safe space relating to biological women. And the Health Secretary is absolutely right to clarify and make it clear that biological men should not have treatment in the same wards and in the same safe spaces as biological women. This is about protecting women's dignity and women's safety and women's privacy. And that's why I'm incredibly supportive and I welcome the announcement today by the Health Secretary.
Thanks very much to Suella Braverman for such an interesting question, posed in the most confident of declaration. And hey, you want to give me my private hospital room every time I'm in hospital, then I'm all for it, Suella. If you can fund me my own hospital room to ensure that I don't, cause any problems, bearing in mind, y'all, that the NHS released a statement saying that transgender women have never, not once, been complained about in women's wards. There has not been one complaint in the whole of the country about transgender women being in women's wards. And yet this is the thing that, but hey, we'll take it for the question we know it was intended to be. But it wasn't the only statement this week that I want to talk about. The other statement, of course, is from the legendary Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Thanks so much to Rishi. So here we go, Rishi Sunak.
And it also shouldn't be controversial for parents to know what their children are being taught in school about relationships. Patients should know when hospitals are talking about men or women. And we shouldn't get bullied. And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Thanks so much to the Prime Minister for such an interesting question, posed, in this case, in a way that denies the fundaments of my existence and those people like me's existence. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to do this, you guys. This one was a corker. Like, we take these for the questions that we hope they're intended to be, but this one was a corker. You know, the Prime Minister, basically saying to raucous applause, hey, trans people, you don't exist. You're not really who you say you are. Sure. Listen, okay. You gotta steel ourselves, center ourselves, take a deep breath, and we will take it for the question that we know it was intended to be, even though it was posed in pretty confident declaration. This week, we want to talk about the sort of public policy that these politicians are advocating for, right? This quite exclusionary public policy that says that transgender women should be considered men in most circumstances, including hospital wards and, generally speaking, in the Prime Minister's case, like just considered to be men, and that trans men should just be considered to be women in public policy. And that is obviously an extreme and quite exclusionary position. And those extreme and quite exclusionary positions have become a little bit more commonplace in Europe and in the US over the past 10 years or so, with the Trump presidency being a big hallmark of that move. But there's actually some really interesting evidence looking at the impact of public policy and how public policy can shape public attitudes. So we're going to take a look at the evidence. What does this kind of exclusionary policy, like this exclusionary philosophy of public policy, do for the trans community, for those who care for them, their parents and guardians? And what does it do? What does it do to public attitudes? And can inclusive public policy help to bring us all closer together? So let's take a look. Our first study we're going to take a look at is super relevant here. It's Harrison and Michelson's in 2017, called Using Experiments to Understand Public Attitudes Towards Transgender Rights. It's really interesting. So they took 443 MTurk workers. And now MTurk workers, I think, is Amazon's crowdsourcing site for workers, essentially. And they paid them to take a look at, essentially being declared to, in written form, to take a look at a series of statements. Now, they gave different workers different statements to read and took a look at how those statements shaped their perception of support for the transgender community. Now, this is a really cool study because the conditions of the study, these different texts, were very, very similar to one another and only were different in some key ways about advocating for or against the trans community. And I love this because it's so difficult. If you think about, you need to create a statement which in all ways can be the same as the statement in the next condition, but in one specific way is pro-trans people and condition B is against trans people. But the statement is so kind of like, it's so generic, but it still doesn't read as generic. It's kind of brilliant that it can be interpreted in both ways. So let's take a look at condition A. They basically said this: keeping kids safe means allowing them to use the restroom without worrying about getting attacked or harassed. To do this, we need to allow transgender youth to use the restroom of their choice. Keep kids safe. Allow kids to use the restroom they prefer, right? And then condition B, the kind of anti-trans condition, says this: keeping kids safe means allowing them to use the restroom without worrying about getting attacked or harassed. To do this, we need to keep men who say they are transgender out of women's restrooms. Keep kids safe. Keep men out of the ladies' room. It's very cool to me that they managed to create these kind of this very I don't know, this very interpretable statement that seems very specific, but that can be interpreted as, with just a little twist, very anti-trans, or just a little twist, very pro-trans. Now, what's interesting is they found that condition B, that sort of negative anti-trans condition, produced the weakest level of support for the transgender community. But in condition A, which we talked about a second ago, they had a bunch of other conditions. We're not going to get into the weeds with it. But condition A, that pro-trans one, produced a much stronger support. The difference is 50% to 67%, which is a big shift in support for the transgender community. So this is the first kind of evidence that, you know, and this is literally just an experimental study. This isn't the Prime Minister saying this, right? This is them just reading a statement in a study. The Prime Minister literally said something very similar to that, like literally said the thing. So we're expecting here that could shape public support in quite significant ways, could change how people perceive, like whether they should be proactive or at least feel positive towards the transgender community. Now, the next study found something quite different, which is really interesting. Now, Flores and colleagues in 2021, anti-discrimination interventions, political ads, and transgender rights. So they're interested in how political advertisements can shift attitudes towards the transgender community. Now, they took two samples, one of 1,291 participants and another of 1,587 participants. And they basically got them to watch these ads. They did a couple of other things about like asking them to perspective take and asking them to think about experiences of discrimination, to take a look at how these things sort of influenced attitudes. They found, interestingly, that perspective taking is really protective, and also knowing transgender people is quite protective, I guess for the same reason. So that's kind of interesting. But these guys found, very interestingly, that the political advertisements that they exposed participants to didn't influence their they basically got them to see the advertisements and asked them, in terms of policies governing public restrooms, do you think these policies should require transgender individuals to use the restroom that corresponds with their birth gender, or allow transgender individuals to use the restroom that corresponds with their gender identity? So they showed them two ads which are related to Houston Proposition 1, which was about kind of trying to exclude transgender people from the restrooms that that best suit them, basically. And this was a huge kind of political movement in the States around Proposition 1, trying to kind of like either prohibit trans people from using the bathroom of their choice or permit them to do so. And, you know, it was an amazing kind of advert that basically featured like this hooded man who could, you know, come into the women's restroom, any man at any time, in inverted commas, to harm girls, basically. And it was this awful advert that ended with this man approaching this young girl in a bathroom stall, just obviously extremely kind of inflammatory and very frightening, and was designed to be. What was interesting is that these participants didn't, their attitudes were not shaped by this advert. But the researchers highlight that this advert and this argument that allowing transgender women to use women's spaces is somehow increasing the risk of people in those spaces, which, you know, we covered in a previous episode. It doesn't, by the way. But the concept, the perception that it does, might have already shaped public opinion. So the researchers here are saying, listen, we showed people these adverts, but they will have seen adverts like this before in all over the place. And they think that the reason, like previous research, as we've already cited as well, highlights that, you know, negative political adverts should shape public perception. And the fact they didn't find it, to them, meant most likely that these sort of negative ads, these kind of negative statements about transgender people, these negative arguments, were so ubiquitous that our participants had already been influenced by them, and we couldn't be any further influenced by them because they had already found them to be ubiquitous. So I couldn't find anything about like the effects of politicians, like the effects of a prime minister or of a president's statements on public perception. But we'd expect that, if anything, they'd be amplified by the highest person in the land, the most influential person in the land making those statements. You'd think those effects might be amplified. Now, not only do the public policy, like public statements from public figures matter, but the policy that those public figures inform also matters, particularly when it's more exclusionary. As Suella Braverman was kind of suggesting, right? So Leyland and colleagues just this year, really interesting study, absolutely gigantic piece of work, kept in the closet, structural stigma and the timing of sexual minority developmental milestones across 28 European countries. Now, these researchers did this amazing piece of work. They looked at a sample of 111,000 bisexual, gay, and lesbian respondents across 28 European countries. And they looked at kind of the age that they came out, the age that they started to understand their identity, and the age at which they kind of came out and started to let people know about their identity. And they also looked at the structural stigma in these 28 European countries, and they created a score of structural stigma, essentially. They looked at across 4 domains of law and policies: equality and non-discrimination, family, hate crime and speech, and asylum within each country. And they gave them points for like having good policies in these areas. And then they inverted it so that high scores meant you had a sort of higher level of structural stigma, basically. It's really interesting. And they found, I know the question is going to be, what about, where does my country land? You check it out in the references. You'll find Leyland's piece, and you can see a kind of full spread of European countries. But which are the highest and lowest? Because there's 28 of them. We're not going to rank them all here. Which one the highest and lowest? Well, the highest stigma countries were Poland and Italy. Sorry for my Polish and Italian listeners. Apologies, deepest apologies. Highest stigma countries. The lowest stigma country was the UK, amazingly. The laws and non-discrimination policy and hate crime and speech laws and asylum policy and equality and non-discrimination law, equal marriage, all counted towards like a high score for the United Kingdom, which is, a high score of acceptance, a low score of structural stigma, which is really good. Great for us living in the UK, which is kind of amazing as well, given that the Prime Minister just said transgender people aren't real. But fine. And here's the thing. So what did they find happened in these countries that were slightly higher on stigma? Well, they found that while LGB respondents became aware of their identity at the same age across countries with varying levels of structural stigma, whether or not they've ever disclosed their identity to someone else was highly variable. So they came to the conclusion they understood their identities about the same age regardless, right? Regardless of structural stigma around them, they started to understand who they were at about the same age, which says something about the ubiquity. Is that the right word? How universal the experience of being LGBT is. It's just a part of human diversity, right? It's not affected by how welcoming an environment is, but coming out is. So we found that, or these amazing authors found that the odds of never coming out was 1.4 times higher for every standard deviation increase in structural stigma. Bearing in mind that the standard deviation is like the average deviation from the mean. So countries on average had the mean, and then on average deviated from the mean by 1 standard deviation. So it was like 1.5 times higher odds of never coming out for each standard deviation. So for people who lived in one of the top 32% of countries experiencing like structural stigma on the structural stigma score, they had a 1.4 times higher odds of never ever coming out. And for those in the top 5%, of countries who have a social stigma score. In the top 5% of social stigma countries, they had a 2.8 times higher odds of never coming out. Can you imagine folks just never coming out? And we found that what's interesting is that these authors found that the timing of coming out and the duration of staying in the closet, which is never not telling anybody about their experience, the timing of their coming out, the time that they spent in the closet also varied as a function of social stigma. So people in the higher stigma countries came out on average 8 months later than those who responded in the lower stigma countries. So not only does being in a high stigma country increase the odds that you will never come out, but even if you do come out, you will very likely spend more time in the closet trying to hide your identity, trying to hide who you are, such a fundamental part of ourselves, because we exist in a more in a country with a higher social stigma, particularly in terms of public policy. Of course, this isn't just the case in Europe. There's a fantastic study from Rao and colleagues in 2020, You Are Illegal in Your Own Country, which looked at the Supreme Court of India's striking down of the colonial era law of Section 377. Now, Section 377, colonial era law, that basically penalized same-sex sexual activity in India. It disproportionately targeted men who had sex with men and transgender women. And it's really interesting. Of course, it took an extraordinary effort to have that law struck down. And it was only in 2018 that the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional and struck it down permanently. Now, these authors took a look at 170 participants who were men and women and non-binary folk who were sexual minorities in India. And they basically found that of these participants, 90% reported perceiving Section 377 to impact their lives. They said things like this: "I'm scared to admit my sexuality in the environments that I live and work in. I have to constantly lie when questions about my marriage come up. I'm unable to bring my partner for trips taken with colleagues and their straight spouses." They found that these participants were overwhelmingly negatively influenced by this law, having only recently been struck down. So while the law no longer exists, of course, public opinion has been shaped by it. One of the terrible sort of consequences of colonialism, essentially. Participants reported overwhelmingly that Section 377 contributed to their social and legal mistreatment and furthered societal stigma against LGBTQ individuals. They expressed concerns about mental health, being labeled a criminal, and living in a society that did not accept them. Participants also felt pressure to conceal their sexual and gender identities and reported feeling fearful, angry, and dehumanized. It's a beautiful study and brings important attention to the challenges of colonial era laws shaping public opinion once again, and creating a context where people don't feel like they can be themselves, and certainly don't feel like they can be out and themselves. Now, this kind of shaping of public perception from policy and laws is really interesting. But what we find in the research is that it isn't really that has the most significant impact on LGBTQIA communities, though it does have it does have an impact. What really has a strong impact is the fear of losing rights on changing laws. Now, this is really interesting. So there's a bunch of research, both qualitative and quantitative, looking at the impact of the fear of changing laws on the LGBTQIA plus community. And the first is a really interesting study from Hutu and colleagues in 2021, Uncertainty and Confusion Regarding Transgender and Non-Discrimination Policies, Implications for the Mental Health of Transgender Americans. So the sample was recruited from Massachusetts and Rhode Island residents, about 580 of them. This is kind of an interesting study and an interesting sample. So there were on average 31.3 years of age, these participants, but also like 43.8% of them were non-binary, which is really interesting. Huge proportion of the sample were non-binary, and the majority were white non-Hispanic, 82%, and most were college educated. What's really interesting is it's quite an abused sample. Forgive me, we're going to talk about abuse for a moment. The prevalence of self-reported abuse was high, both in childhood, just shy of half of participants reporting abuse, and adulthood. Again, just shy of half of participants reporting abuse in adulthood. So a really kind of specific sample. And they took a look at basically asking folk about their experiences of the change in policies that are happening in the US. So they were looking at things like the transgender military ban. They were looking at the rollback of transgender protections in public schools, looking at healthcare, employment, housing, public spaces. And they really found that people had a range of awareness of those rights. But they did find that about half feared their rights would be taken away by politicians in their state. And indeed, there had been political rollback of transgender rights in Rhode Island, etc. So, and Massachusetts. So, yeah, it's understandable they would have that fear. But what's interesting is that fear. So, granted, this was a sample that had experienced a lot of abuse. So, in their analysis, the authors controlled for experiences of abuse in their analysis, and they found that while that was controlled for, the experience of being concerned about the future implementation of state anti-transgender legislation, was associated with an elevated odds of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So just the fear of rollback of rights is enough to trigger some pretty significant emotional impacts in this sample. Interesting. Now, to look in detail at people's experiences of this kind of fear, there's a beautiful series of studies, really. One by Kidd and colleagues in 2021, which, forgive me for the naming of this study, "This Could Mean Death for My Child: Parent Perspectives on Laws Banning Gender-Affirming Care for Transgender Adolescents." So, again, in the US, we have this sort of context. Just had a Trump administration until Joe Biden took over. And during the Trump administration, we saw quite a significant rollback of protections. And we're seeing across US states, particularly conservative states, rolling back access, particularly for children and young people, to gender-affirming care, which is really interesting context to bear in mind. But these folks were looking at the qualitative experiences of particularly parents and their parents of gender diverse children, basically. And they analyzed responses from 273 participants from across 43 states in the US. Most of them identified as white, 86%. Most of them identified as female, 90%, and mothers, 94%. And 83% of their transgender and gender diverse youth had received gender-affirming medical interventions before the age of 18 years. So all of that's really relevant contextual information. And what they found was that these parents pretty consistently considered that affirmative care was emotionally protective, and had quite significant fears that the risk of removing it, and that removing those kind of protections would lead to worsening emotional well-being, possibly even to the extent of their child harming themselves. So I'm going to read out a few direct quotes that are really impressive from this work. I appreciate so much that people are being so open with these researchers about their experience. It's going to be a little bit sensitive, so forgive me for a moment. We're just going to read their actual experiences, because there's nothing quite reading people's literal words. "This law would take away the ability to provide my child with the medical care she needs. If a law like this were to be passed in my state, we would have to move. If it became federal law, we would leave the country. It is unacceptable to force a child to go through the wrong puberty based on the ignorance of other people." Overridingly, these often mothers were, as you would expect, ferociously protective of their children. This is the mother of a transgender daughter from New York. if they were to openly be open-minded and get to know a transgender youth, I do not know how they could not want to support their decision and realize this is not a choice for them, but rather who they are. This is from the mother of a transgender son from Ohio. Even if they do not pass, just the news cycle letting him know that people hate him, despise him, and have no larger concerns than to dispose of his very existence is a very trying experience. And the mother of a transgender daughter from Connecticut. My daughter tried to harm herself at a very early age due to her misery of having male parts. She only got hopeful when her doctor told her she would not go through male puberty. Male puberty would kill my daughter. It's... I find it pretty speechless to hear from these folk. And kind of... I just think I'm really appreciative of people being so open with researchers and trying to shape the world by letting people know about their experiences is an amazing thing to my mind. Now, Abro and colleagues in 2022, and then again in 2022, they seem to have published 2 studies, both looking again at parents' experiences of gender-affirming care bans on their children. Really interesting. So in the first study, there are 134 parents of transgender and gender diverse youth, mean age of 47, just shy of 47 years of age. And they resided across 37 states in 4 regions of the US: South, Northeast, Midwest, and West. And they found, not surprisingly once again, that their experience is that their children are impacted negatively by the passing of these laws. They describe mental health struggles, including suicidality, depression, anxiety, and gender dysphoria, and that parents of underage children, so that's children of 17 years or younger, were significantly more impacted. They found that those parents' reviews of their children's, the impacts on their children, the impacts were more significant for those children who were 17 years or younger. And these parents were, again, just very vehemently opposed to the passing of these laws and to their debating at all. It's been hard, says one parent. The same week that most of these laws were proposed, I had a co-worker tell me that she thinks I abused my son by letting him get a hormone blocker. I didn't feel safe at work anymore. I couldn't even walk through the door without crying. The thing is, if states are passing these laws, how could I prove she was wrong? I'm terrified of being called in for child abuse for supporting my child through this journey. And then there's this quote, which really struck me. He and his transgender group of other kids fully believe that they will be eventually forced by law to attend conversion camps. They are scared every day. Can't they just be kids? Can't we just love them and make sure they have what they need? So far we've had some interesting evidence that, both the big statements made by politicians, the advertising that goes on that might be pro or anti-trans, often anti-trans in the public media in the UK, and the sort of the public laws and the threat of future laws all have kind of a negative impact on gender diverse communities. It's not super surprising, and the most significant effects seem to be being reported by parents who are reviewing their children's experience of seeing these bills pass and these debates occur, and the sort of the threat that imposes upon them as being quite significant. And it's an existential threat, right? So no wonder it would have such a significant impact on these young people. And in the UK, we can see that public attitudes towards the transgender community are deteriorating. Now, we don't exactly know why this is, but my guess would be that as we see, the passing of these laws or the debating of these laws and these constant, public figures talking about transgender people in negative terms, as has a deleterious effect on people's attitudes. So there's the British Social Attitude Survey is an important survey that gets released every so often in the UK. And most recently, I think it was in 2021. In fact, I think there's one that's coming out this year. Hasn't been released yet, I don't think. And we can see that social attitudes towards the transgender population are changing over time. So there's one in 2016, one in 2019, and one in 2021. And they asked the same question each time. Should transgender people be able to change the sex on their birth certificate? That's the question. In 2016, 58% said agreed with that statement that they should, and 22% said that they disagreed. In 2019, 53% agreed and 24% disagreed. And then in 2021, only 32% agreed and 39% disagreed, with 28% neither agreeing nor disagreeing. So for the first time in the British Social Attitudes Survey, we see more people disagreeing than agreeing with that statement. The attitudes towards the transgender population turning unfavorable over time, particularly when it comes to changing the sex on their birth certificate. It's kind of, I find that remarkable, that over that time, in just a few years, really, we see that, what was very positive support for the transgender community, particularly around this question, has turned much sourer over time, which is fascinating and a little bit disheartening. And I guess not super surprising when the Prime Minister makes statements, as we heard. But here's something a little bit more optimistic, because actually there's a wave of research here that looks at the positive effects of inclusive law and policy, which is far more positive. So let's take a look at those now. So the first is Earl and colleagues, 2021. They did a multi-level analysis of LGBT rights and support across 77 countries. That's no small feat. So 77 countries, 72, just shy of 72,000 participants, and they looked at the influence of LGBT rights support and contact with LGBT folk. So the question of, does the support for transgender rights, is that influenced by the public policies around you, but also is it influenced by your own personal experience of contact with people from the transgender community? And is there an interaction effect there, such that people who have more contact in a positive country, is there a stronger effect on their sort of positive attitudes towards transgender rights than in a country with less political support? Now, of course, what they found is super interesting, but they found, of course, that living in a country that has greater sort of support for gay and lesbian rights politically leads to a greater support for LGBT rights personally, both for gay and lesbian rights and for transgender people. So that in and of itself is kind of interesting. But they also found that personal contact with marginalized populations also increases the support for those populations. But here's what's really interesting. There was an interaction effect. So in countries that had less political support, that had less sort of political rights afforded to LGBT folk, the contact with LGBT folk had a stronger effect on support for those rights. So what this is evidence of is that, people being out and proud and public and letting people know about their experience and being out there. I was listening to a TED talk from a disabled woman who made this statement that I found really exciting. She says, let them see you, make them see you, and let them stare. And this is interesting. I love that statement. But this evidence suggests that being out and being in social contact with people improves their experience of and support for your marginalized community, which is super, super important. Next up, we have Lombardi and colleagues, Lombardi and Sani from 2023, looking at anti-discrimination legislation and the impact on transgender people within the USA. They got 27,000 participants from 50 states. And for sure, it's from the US Transgender Survey. You know the one by now. Very famous survey used for all kinds of things. Large sample, and they took a look at the relationship between non-discrimination, public accommodation, hate crime, and a ban on Medicaid exclusion legislation each associated. So basically, non-discrimination policy, public accommodation, hate crime laws, and the ban on Medicaid exclusion, so preventing transgender people from being excluded from Medicaid, which is horrifying that that's even a thing, all were associated with less distress, particularly for those who didn't use gender-affirming medical care. It didn't seem to affect people who did use gender-affirming medical care, presumably because their personal experience overrode the public accommodation otherwise they might have been affected by. But for people who did not use gender-affirming medical care, it had a significant effect on their emotional well-being in a bunch of ways. And what's interesting though, is once again, having more people know about your transgender identity reduced your distress, particularly among those who did use gender affirming medical services. So people being open and being like out in the world and finding acceptance in the world can ameliorate some of the influences of these more discriminatory public policies. But moreover, people who don't do that, people who don't use medical care services, are influenced by the non-discrimination, public accommodation, hate crime laws, and bans on healthcare. So we want to kind of ensure that, to make sure that we are looking after this particular community who don't use transition-related services. We've got to make sure that we have good, strong, accepting public policy. Just a few more studies left then. Miller, Jacobs and colleagues in 2023, they looked at one of the huge studies in the United States across 14 states that engage in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that was conducted in 2019. That's over 100,000 young people in the analysis. They were able to separate out those young people who identified as transgender. That's 1.7% or 1,790 participants. And they were able to compare them with cisgender adolescents. What was interesting is that the transgender adolescents, compared to their cisgender counterparts, those who weren't transgender, those who were transgender were more likely to experience adverse health outcomes. But in states that had explicit transgender guidance in their anti-discrimination laws, those young people who lived there were less likely to experience depressive symptoms than those who lived in a state that didn't have such guidance. And those who lived in a state with positive or neutral athlete guidance were less likely to report the past 30-day cigarette use, which is a really interesting piece of a really interesting finding. So a range of benefits to having positive, inclusive policy. Now, in lieu of being able to do this in all states or in all countries, schools obviously can't influence public policy. So here we are saying, yeah, for sure, Rishi Sunak and for sure, Suella Braverman, maybe we need to do better. But in lieu of being able to do that, we do find that there's a handful of studies that looked at school policy. So Ioverno in 2023, gotta love that author. We keep finding them in our work. Fields and colleagues in 2022, Harper and colleagues in 2022, all looked at the influence of discriminatory or non-discrimination policy in schools. Now, the biggest of these is Ioverno's, who looked at 66,851 LGBTI youth aged 15 to 24 from 30 EU countries who completed the EU LGBTI survey in 2019. Now, participants reported on feelings of sadness, depression, life satisfaction, and safety at school, being out at school, and experiences of bias-based school violence and experiences of general and bias-based harassment in the community. Now, the authors found a couple of really interesting points, and I think this is this punctuates what we need to do to support this community, right? First of all, we need to create public policy and laws that are more inclusive. Of course we do. But while that might take some time and maybe a change in government to enact, what we have in the meantime are some things that we can do in school. Now, these results, this huge across-European sample, found that for teacher training, more inclusivity in teacher training and in the curriculum was significantly associated with a lower odds of perceiving a lack of school safety in your school by 17% and 16%. and lowered the feelings of depression and sadness among LGBTI youth by 10%. So this had a significant effect, just better inclusivity in teacher training and in the curriculum. But here's where the really interesting and powerful effect was found. So for each protected group on the ground of sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and variations in sex characteristics enumerated in multiple school policies. So protected groups being thought about and included across school policies, LGBTI youth were 38% less likely in those schools to perceive a lack of school safety, 23% less likely to conceal their identity at school, and 24% more likely to experience life satisfaction. So I think here we're narrowing in on an answer to this question, right? Not only do, in lieu of changing public policy, we can nonetheless create quite inclusive school environments by just including, thinking about gender and sexually diverse folk in teacher training and in the curriculum, and by thinking about those folk when we're creating school policies. All we need to do is to create school contexts where, children, young people who are gender and sexually diverse can, essentially see themselves protected in the school policies and can feel okay with coming out. And as we find, more people who meet and know gender diverse and sexually diverse folk, they're going to feel more positive towards those folk and want to protect their rights. So that can only be a good thing, a virtuous cycle, as we try to create school contexts where, they're designed with all children and young people in mind. And listen, in direct answer to the question from the Prime Minister, when you make public declarations that say that transgender people cannot change sex, which is, by the way, not what the law states as far as I can understand the Equality Act, right? As far as I can understand the Gender Recognition Act, we can change sex. In fact, transgender people are real. We're real. We're not going anywhere. And we're going to, in lieu of you creating public policy that makes space for us, that gives us a place to exist in the world, we will do it for ourselves. Because that's what we do. Transgender people and the gender diverse kin, we are real. We're here and we are absolutely not going anywhere. We'll do what we always do. We'll come together and create community. And we'll create a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thank you so very much for joining me. As always, this is Classroom Psychology. You are very welcome here, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.